The Galactic Assembly held a massive military exhibition every year on a space station called Nexus Prime, and this event was essentially the biggest show of technological power in the entire known universe. Imagine hundreds of different alien civilizations, each one having traveled through space for thousands of years, all bringing their absolute best military hardware to display in one place. Every major galactic power sent representatives carrying detailed information about their newest warships, their most advanced fighter spacecraft, and whatever other impressive military technology they had recently developed. The whole point was to show off in front of diplomats and military observers who had come from every corner of explored space to see what everyone else was capable of building and deploying. The exhibition actually served two very important purposes, though most species were polite enough not to say these things out loud in official diplomatic language. First, it was obviously a demonstration of military strength where each civilization could show everyone else exactly what kind of firepower and defensive capabilities they possessed. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it functioned as a subtle but very clear warning to anyone who might be thinking about causing trouble or starting conflicts. The underlying message was simple. Look at what we can build, look at how powerful our weapons are, and think very carefully before you decide to become our enemy. In this era of generally peaceful galactic cooperation, species competed with each other not by actually fighting wars, which had become relatively uncommon, but through this kind of technological one-upmanship. Each civilization was essentially trying to prove that their engineers were smarter, their scientists were more innovative, and their industrial capacity was more impressive than everyone else's. When humanity received their formal invitation to participate in this year's exhibition, it created a huge amount of debate and discussion back at Terran Space Command headquarters on Earth. The invitation itself was significant because humans had only been official members of the Galactic Assembly for 8 years total, which made them extremely new compared to the other species involved. Some of these alien civilizations had been part of the Assembly for literally thousands of years. Earth was joining a political and military structure that had existed and continuously evolved for over 12,000 years of documented galactic history. That kind of timeline was almost impossible for humans to really comprehend. Most of the well-established alien species looked at humans with a complicated mix of emotions. There was some curiosity about these strange newcomers, but there was also a lot of barely hidden condescension and dismissiveness. Many aliens viewed humans as primitive upstarts who had somehow stumbled into galactic affairs way too early, probably decades or even centuries before they were actually ready to participate as genuine equals alongside civilizations that had been exploring space since before human civilization even existed on Earth. The internal debate within human military leadership focused on what seemed like a straightforward question but actually had really profound implications for how the galaxy would perceive humanity going forward. The question was simple. Which ship should Earth send to represent human capabilities and human military philosophy before all these assembled galactic powers? It seemed like it should be an easy decision, but the more the military planners thought about it, the more complicated it became. Earth's newest carriers and dreadnoughts were genuinely impressive by human standards. These modern vessels incorporated all kinds of sophisticated alien technologies that humanity had managed to acquire through recent diplomatic agreements and trade relationships with species willing to share knowledge with the newcomers. The newest human warships could legitimately hold their own in most tactical scenarios and represented real achievements in human engineering and our ability to adapt and learn from more advanced civilizations. But Admiral Victoria Hayes, who was one of the most respected senior officers in the Terran fleet, had a completely different idea that initially sounded absolutely crazy to almost everyone who heard it. Hayes wanted to send the UESC Perseverance to represent humanity at the exhibition. This proposal shocked people because the Perseverance was a heavy cruiser that had been originally commissioned 43 years earlier, way back during the very early days of human space exploration when Earth was still completely isolated and had never made contact with any alien species. The ship had been designed and constructed entirely using human engineering principles and human assumptions about what space combat might look like, with absolutely zero alien influence or guidance of any kind because humans did not even know aliens existed when they built it. By modern galactic standards, and honestly even by current human standards, the Perseverance looked like something that belonged in a museum rather than active military service. The ship completely lacked the smooth, elegant flowing lines that made Hellion battlecruisers so beautiful to look at. It did not have the sophisticated adaptive shield technology that made Tarn destroyers nearly impossible to damage in combat. Its weapons were primitive kinetic railguns and conventional missile systems rather than the advanced directed energy weapons that every modern military force in the galaxy used as standard equipment. The armor was just simple composite plating, basically multiple layers of different materials stacked on top of each other, rather than the smart materials that could actually repair themselves and redistribute damage that more advanced species had invented. The Perseverance had spent the last 20 years of its existence serving mostly as a training vessel where new officers and crew members could learn basic procedures. It was considered too outdated for real frontline combat duty but still too expensive and too functional to just scrap for parts. Admiral Hayes had complex reasoning behind this seemingly bizarre proposal, and it was rooted in her deep understanding of military strategy and also the psychology of interstellar politics. She explained very carefully to the Space Command Council during multiple planning meetings that sending humanity's newest and most advanced ships would actually accomplish nothing useful for Earth's political standing. The basic problem was that humanity simply could not compete in a direct technological comparison with alien species that had literally thousands of years of accumulated scientific knowledge and engineering experience. Any attempt to show off cutting-edge human technology would just invite immediate comparison with equivalent alien systems that would almost certainly turn out to be more sophisticated, more efficient, and more powerful in every measurable way. But the Perseverance represented something fundamentally different that might actually communicate important truths about humanity to observers who were paying close attention. This was a ship built entirely from human innovation, designed to solve problems using distinctly human ways of thinking, created without any alien help or influence whatsoever. Hayes believed very strongly that showing the galaxy what humans could accomplish completely on their own, using only their own resources and their own engineering philosophy that had developed during Earth's isolation, would send a more important and lasting message than any demonstration that humanity had learned to copy alien technology reasonably well. Captain Thomas Bradford stood in the grand reception hall wearing his formal dress uniform, and for what felt like the 100th time that evening, he listened to another alien diplomat make jokes about how primitive and outdated his ship was. The comments kept coming in steady waves throughout the night. Some aliens were more polite about it, wrapping their criticism in diplomatic language that was technically respectful but clearly dismissive. Others were more direct, openly laughing at the technical specifications of the Perseverance and questioning whether humanity had accidentally brought a museum exhibit instead of an actual working warship. Bradford kept his face completely neutral through all of it, not letting any of his real feelings show to the crowd of observers watching his every reaction. He had been thoroughly briefed before arriving at Nexus Prime about exactly what to expect from the other species. Admiral Hayes had been very clear in her instructions. Bradford was supposed to maintain perfect diplomatic composure no matter what happened, no matter how insulting the comments became, no matter how much the mockery stung his pride or the pride of his crew. He understood intellectually that this was all part of Hayes's larger strategy. The whole point was to let the other species underestimate humanity and dismiss their capabilities as primitive. But understanding something intellectually and actually enduring it emotionally were two very different things. Bradford had been through combat situations that were genuinely life-threatening, moments where he thought he might die, and somehow those experiences had been less frustrating than standing here listening to comfortable alien civilizations laugh at everything he and his crew had worked so hard to accomplish. Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez stood next to Bradford throughout the entire uncomfortable reception, fulfilling her role as executive officer but also serving as a calming presence during what was becoming an increasingly difficult evening for everyone in the human delegation. She could see the tension in Bradford's shoulders and the tightness around his eyes that other species probably would not recognize but that she knew well after serving under his command for 3 years. At one point, when a particularly loud group of Karath officers started making especially rude comments about human engineering being centuries behind modern standards, Rodriguez leaned in close and whispered quietly so only Bradford could hear her. She suggested that they should just endure the remaining days of the exhibition without trying to prove anything, then return home to Earth with their dignity intact and their mission technically complete. They had shown up as requested, they had represented humanity, and that was enough. Bradford knew Rodriguez was right. Her advice was sensible and mature, the kind of practical wisdom that made her an excellent officer. But knowing she was right did not make it any easier to accept emotionally. Some part of Bradford, a part he usually kept carefully controlled and buried deep, desperately wanted a chance to demonstrate that the Perseverance was far more capable than these comfortable, arrogant civilizations understood or appreciated. He wanted an opportunity to show them what human engineering could actually accomplish when it was pushed to its absolute limits. He wanted to prove that all their mockery and dismissiveness was based on ignorance and assumptions rather than real understanding. But opportunities like that did not just appear on demand, and Bradford resigned himself to enduring the rest of the exhibition with as much grace as he could manage. That opportunity he had been wishing for would arrive far sooner than anyone could have possibly anticipated, though it would come in a form that nobody could have predicted or planned for in advance. The military exhibition had been carefully organized and scheduled to run for 6 complete days. The planners had arranged various demonstrations, technical displays, and presentations designed to showcase different aspects of military capability and technological advancement from all the participating species. Everything was supposed to proceed in an orderly, controlled fashion that would allow each civilization to present their best achievements without any unexpected disruptions. But early on the morning of the third day, before most of the scheduled events had even started, something happened that changed everything and transformed the comfortable exhibition into a genuine emergency. An urgent distress call suddenly came through to Nexus Prime from a star system that was relatively close by in astronomical terms, though still many light-years away. The message was being broadcast on emergency frequencies that automatically got priority routing to every military vessel and command center in the region. The distress call reported that a large civilian transport ship called the Harmony's Promise was in serious trouble. The vessel was carrying over 1,500 passengers who represented multiple different species and cultures from across the galaxy. These were not military personnel or trained emergency responders. These were regular civilians, families with children, elderly individuals, people who had simply been traveling between star systems for work or personal reasons and now found themselves in a nightmare situation through no fault of their own. According to the increasingly desperate messages coming from the Harmony's Promise, the ship had experienced what they described as catastrophic systems failure. This was not a minor technical problem that their crew could fix with some basic repairs. This was a complete breakdown of multiple critical systems simultaneously. The ship's main propulsion drives had gone completely offline and would not restart no matter what the engineering teams tried. Their backup systems were failing one after another in cascade failures that nobody could stop. Most critically and terrifyingly, the transport had lost all ability to maneuver or change its course. The ship was now drifting helplessly through space, carried forward purely by whatever momentum it had built up before the systems failed, with absolutely no way to steer or slow down or avoid obstacles. The situation was about to get much worse because of where the ship was drifting. Directly in the path of the Harmony's Promise was a dense debris field, a region of space filled with countless fragments of rock and metal ranging in size from tiny pebbles to chunks as large as buildings. This debris field was classified as extremely hazardous to navigation under normal circumstances. Ships with full power and working shields could navigate through it carefully, but even then it was considered dangerous. A ship with no power, no shields, and no ability to maneuver would be torn completely apart within minutes of entering that field. The impacts would breach the hull in dozens of places simultaneously. Atmosphere would explosively vent into space. The structure would break apart under the stress. And all 1,500 passengers aboard would die horrible deaths. The distress call included precise calculations about timing, and those numbers were absolutely unforgiving. Based on the ship's current velocity and trajectory, the Harmony's Promise would reach the outer edge of the debris field in approximately 4 hours and 17 minutes. That gave potential rescuers a very narrow window to somehow reach the ship, stabilize the situation, and either repair their systems or physically move them out of danger. Every military vessel docked at or near Nexus Prime for the exhibition received this distress call at the same moment through the automatic emergency broadcast system. Suddenly, all the theoretical discussions about whose weapons were more impressive or whose shields were more sophisticated seemed completely meaningless and trivial. Real people were about to die unless someone actually did something to help them, and they needed that help right now. Captain Bradford made his decision fast once he had double-checked that the Perseverance actually had the right capabilities for what this rescue mission would require. He opened a direct communication line to the command center at Nexus Prime and formally volunteered his ship and his crew to handle the rescue operation. The response he got back was not exactly encouraging. The alien officer running the command center sounded extremely skeptical, and you could hear the doubt clearly in his voice even through the translation systems. This was the same human vessel that literally everyone had been openly mocking and making jokes about for the past 2 days. Now Bradford was claiming it could perform a rescue operation that ships with far more advanced technology were saying was too difficult or maybe even impossible to accomplish safely. Bradford understood the skepticism, but he also understood that time was running out for those 1,500 civilians. He did not waste precious minutes trying to argue his case or give persuasive speeches about human determination and capability. Instead, he did something much more effective. He simply transmitted detailed technical data directly to the command center. The files he sent included complete specifications showing exactly how the Perseverance's hull had been structurally reinforced beyond normal standards. He included the precise power output ratings of the ship's tractor beam systems, which were designed for industrial applications like asteroid mining and were considerably more powerful than what most military vessels carried. He sent the training records and qualifications of his engineering teams, showing that they had extensive experience with emergency repairs and damage control procedures. The data spoke for itself much more convincingly than any speech could have. Then Bradford added one more comment that was polite in its wording but very firm in its message. He pointed out that while everyone else was still sitting around holding discussions and debating different theoretical approaches to the problem, the civilian transport was now less than 4 hours away from entering the debris field where it would be completely destroyed. Every minute spent talking was one less minute available to actually save those people. Someone needed to stop debating and start acting immediately, or 1,500 innocent civilians were going to die while military forces watched and discussed options. The authorization for human intervention came through, but Bradford could tell it was not because the station commander suddenly gained confidence in human abilities or felt enthusiastic about letting the primitive newcomers handle such a critical situation. The permission came purely from the uncomfortable reality that nobody else had any better alternatives available within the desperately short time frame they were facing. The station commander gave Bradford official clearance to proceed with his rescue attempt, but at the same time, he also ordered both Helion and Kareth military vessels to move into supporting positions nearby. Those ships were instructed to stand ready to provide immediate assistance if needed. The underlying message in these orders was crystal clear to everyone involved, even though nobody stated it directly in official language. The message was simple. Humanity could go ahead and try their primitive approach using their outdated technology and old-fashioned methods, but the real military forces with proper advanced capabilities would be standing by watching closely. The moment the humans inevitably failed or got themselves into trouble and needed rescuing, the advanced species would be ready to step in and handle things properly. Bradford accepted these conditions without making any complaints or protests. He did not care about the implied insults or the lack of confidence in his abilities. He cared about saving lives, and he had just been given permission to attempt exactly that. He immediately gave orders for the Perseverance to break away from its position in the exhibition formation and proceed at maximum sustainable speed directly toward the reported location of the distressed transport vessel. The ship's engines flared bright as they pushed to full power, and the Perseverance accelerated away from Nexus Prime toward the emergency situation. As the human cruiser rapidly pulled away and disappeared from visual range, Bradford felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was no longer a diplomatic mission where he had to carefully manage perceptions and worry about political consequences. This was no longer some carefully staged exhibition designed to showcase military hardware and impress observers with technological sophistication. This had suddenly transformed into exactly the kind of genuine emergency operation that Bradford and his entire crew had spent their careers training for and preparing to handle. This was what they had signed up for when they joined the military. Not parades and exhibitions, but actual missions where real lives hung in the balance and success or failure had immediate, tangible consequences. The Perseverance might be considered old and obsolete by galactic standards. The wider galaxy might view humans as primitive and technologically backward, still learning the basics of space travel that other species had mastered thousands of years ago. But Bradford knew something that those comfortable, advanced civilizations seemed to have completely forgotten over their long centuries of peace and stability. He knew that sometimes raw capability and versatility mattered far more than having the newest, most sophisticated technology available. Sometimes the best tool for a job was not the most elegant or efficient one, but the one that was tough enough to take punishment and keep working no matter what happened. Sometimes designs that appeared obsolete and outdated had actually persisted and remained in service for very good reasons, because they solved fundamental problems in ways that elegant modern solutions had simply overlooked or optimized away in pursuit of other goals. The Perseverance was about to get a chance to prove exactly what it had been built for all those decades ago. Back when human engineers designed this ship, they had been working in complete isolation with no knowledge that alien civilizations even existed. They had built it assuming the worst possible scenarios, preparing for situations where everything would go wrong simultaneously and help would never arrive when you needed it most. They had designed for survival and versatility rather than optimization and specialization. And now, in this moment of genuine crisis, all of those old-fashioned design choices were about to show their true value. The ship reached the Drifting Harmony's promise with 4 to 7 minutes to spare before the civilian vessel would enter the most dangerous part of the debris field. Bradford brought his ship alongside carefully and immediately started deploying every sensor system the Perseverance carried to build detailed maps of the surrounding space. What those sensors showed him confirmed his worst fears about just how difficult this rescue was going to be. The debris field ahead was not some simple collection of rocks floating in predictable orbits that could be easily calculated and avoided. It was the ancient remains of a planetary collision that had happened millions of years ago, creating a chaotic nightmare zone where fragments ranging from dust particles to mountain-sized chunks tumbled in complex, overlapping patterns that interacted with each other in ways that made accurate prediction nearly impossible. The ship's navigation computer analyzed all this data and immediately classified the entire region as a Level 9 hazard, which was basically the computer's way of saying that trying to fly through this area was barely different from deliberately committing suicide. The Perseverance activated its primary tractor beam system and locked onto the Harmony's Promise with incredibly powerful magnetic forces. These forces were so strong that if they had grabbed onto a ship with weaker construction, they would have literally ripped that vessel apart like tearing paper. The massive transport shuddered violently the moment the beam took hold, and Bradford could immediately hear urgent warning alarms coming through his communication system from the engineering section deep in the ship's lower decks. His engineers were reporting that the ship's structural frame was absorbing forces and stresses that it had never been specifically designed to handle during routine operations. The metal was being pushed to its limits in ways that the original designers probably never tested during standard simulations. But here was the thing about the Perseverance that made all the difference. The ship had been deliberately over-engineered by paranoid human designers who had built it decades ago when Earth was completely isolated and had no idea what dangers might be waiting out in space. Those engineers had made a specific assumption that guided every decision they made. They assumed their ships would regularly face situations that went well beyond normal operational parameters and expected conditions. They built in extra strength, extra reinforcement, extra safety margins everywhere they could, even though it made the ship heavier and less efficient by normal standards. So when the tractor beam engaged and started putting enormous stress on the frame, the Perseverance groaned and creaked and the metal complained loudly, but ultimately the structure held firm and did not fail. The tractor beam connection stabilized after those first few violent seconds of initial shock, and Bradford gave his helm officer the permission to begin the actual towing operation that would take them into the debris field. Lieutenant Kevin Park sat at the helm controls with his hands resting on the manual piloting interface, and he felt the enormous weight of responsibility settle over him like an actual physical burden pressing down on his shoulders. Park was widely considered one of the absolute best pilots in the entire Terran fleet, and there were good reasons for that reputation. Unlike many species who had evolved in space environments or low-gravity worlds, Park had originally trained as an atmospheric pilot back on Earth, flying actual aircraft through air where you had to deal with wind, weather, gravity, and all the complex forces that affected flight in a planetary atmosphere. Only after mastering that had he transitioned to space operations. This background gave him something valuable that many alien pilots simply did not possess naturally. He understood three-dimensional navigation and momentum management in ways that were deeply intuitive rather than just mathematical. Species that had evolved in zero-gravity environments often relied heavily on computer assistance because their brains had not developed the same spatial reasoning that came from evolving on a planet with gravity. Bradford trusted Park's instincts and abilities completely, and he was about to put that trust to the ultimate test. Park began carefully guiding both vessels toward the debris field, using minimal thruster power to avoid putting additional stress on the tractor beam connection. He relied heavily on the constant stream of sensor data flowing to his console, information that updated every fraction of a second as conditions changed in the chaotic environment ahead. What followed over the next 2 hours would be talked about and analyzed by military observers for years afterward. People who witnessed it would describe what Park accomplished as some of the most intense and skillful piloting they had ever seen in their entire careers, the kind of performance that seemed almost impossible when you looked at the numbers and understood what he was actually doing. Park threaded both vessels through that deadly debris field using an approach that combined two very different methods in ways that complemented each other perfectly. For the elements that were predictable and followed standard orbital mechanics, he used computer-calculated trajectories that could plot the safest path through the obstacles. But the debris field was far from entirely predictable. Chunks of rock and metal would suddenly tumble in unexpected directions due to collisions with other fragments or complex gravitational interactions that the computers could not calculate fast enough. For these unpredictable elements, Park relied on pure human intuition, that ability to see developing patterns and react to threats before they fully materialized. His hands moved constantly on the controls, making tiny adjustments every few seconds to keep both ships on the safest possible path through the chaos. Then something unexpected happened that showed just how wrong the alien observers had been about the Perseverance being obsolete and useless. The ship's kinetic weapons, those primitive railguns that had been so thoroughly mocked during the exhibition as hopelessly outdated technology that belonged in museums, suddenly found an entirely new purpose that their designers had never specifically planned for. These weapons had been originally built to fire large, heavy projectiles at high velocity to punch through enemy armor during ship-to-ship combat. But Park and the tactical team realized they could also fire much smaller projectiles at lower velocities for a completely different purpose. They started using the railguns as improvised point defense systems to protect both ships from debris. When sensor systems detected fragments of rock or metal on trajectories that would impact either the Perseverance or the transport, and when those fragments could not be avoided through maneuvering because the ships were too large and moving too fast to dodge everything, the railguns would fire. Small tungsten projectiles would shoot out and either completely destroy the incoming debris or deflect it just enough to make it miss. The weapons that everyone had laughed at as primitive and obsolete were now saving lives by performing a function that sophisticated modern energy weapons actually could not do as effectively. Energy weapons were great for ship combat, but for physically destroying or deflecting solid objects, sometimes you needed something that could deliver actual kinetic impact. The Perseverance's armor took continuous punishment throughout this entire operation. The ship was constantly being hit by small debris fragments that were too numerous for the point defense systems to catch everything. Modern ships with their adaptive energy shields would have deflected these relatively minor impacts easily and efficiently without taking any real damage. But the Perseverance relied on old-fashioned physical armor, just layers of composite material designed to absorb impacts through direct contact. With each passing minute, the armor became more and more damaged. It got scarred and dented. External sensor arrays mounted on the hull were completely destroyed by direct hits. Entire sections of the outer armor plating were literally scraped away when asteroids passed within just meters of the hull, close enough that the rocks actually made physical contact with the ship's surface. But here was what mattered. Beneath all that visible exterior damage that was accumulating on the outside, the ship's truly vital internal systems remained protected and functional. The Perseverance had multiple redundant layers of internal shielding and structural reinforcement protecting the critical components. The engines kept running. The life support kept working. The tractor beam maintained its grip on the transport. The ship was taking a beating that looked absolutely terrible from the outside, bleeding from dozens of wounds across its hull, but it had been specifically designed and built to bleed extensively while continuing to fight and function effectively. The journey back to Nexus Prime was completely different in every way from when the Perseverance had left just hours earlier. The ship that slowly came back into view looked like it had been through an actual war rather than a rescue operation. The Perseverance was visibly damaged in ways that were impossible to miss even from a distance. The hull was covered with obvious scars from hundreds of individual impacts with debris. Entire sections of the outer armor plating were missing, torn away or vaporized by the forces the ship had endured. External equipment that had been mounted on the hull was either destroyed or hanging loose from damaged connections. There was clear evidence everywhere you looked that the ship's systems had been pushed far beyond their normal design limitations and into territory that most engineers would consider catastrophic failure conditions. But despite looking absolutely terrible from the outside, the ship was still functional in all the ways that actually mattered. The engines were running and responding to commands. The life support systems were keeping the crew alive and healthy. The structural integrity was compromised in some areas, but the ship was not in danger of breaking apart. Most importantly, every single member of the crew was alive and intact, with only minor injuries that the medical team could easily handle. And trailing behind the battered Perseverance, still held firmly in the tractor beam's grip, was the Harmony's promise with all 1,500 civilian passengers safe and completely unharmed. The rescue operation that so many observers had expected to fail catastrophically had actually succeeded beyond what anyone thought possible. The immediate response from the various species gathered at Nexus Prime was organized chaos as everyone suddenly shifted from being competitive rivals to being helpful neighbors. Multiple alien species rushed forward to provide whatever assistance they could offer. Medical ships deployed to help treat the few passengers on the transport who had sustained injuries during the crisis. Engineering vessels moved in close to assess the damage to both ships and figure out what repairs were most urgently needed. Supply ships arrived carrying replacement parts and materials. What had been a competitive military exhibition just hours earlier, where everyone was trying to prove their superiority over everyone else, transformed instantly into a genuine cooperative rescue operation. Former rivals who had been subtly insulting each other were now working side by side to help survivors and repair critical damage. It was a powerful reminder that despite all the political posturing and rivalry, the species in the Galactic Assembly were still capable of coming together and cooperating when the situation truly demanded it. The political implications of what had happened took considerably longer to fully develop, but they would ultimately prove far more significant and lasting than the immediate humanitarian response. Military analysts and tactical experts from dozens of different species began requesting access to the detailed telemetry data from the Perseverance's entire operation. They wanted to study exactly what the human ship had done, how it had survived conditions that should have destroyed it, and what techniques the crew had used to accomplish a mission that more advanced vessels had deemed too difficult or too dangerous. As these analysts dug into the data and really examined what had occurred, a profound realization began spreading through the galactic military community. The human vessel had accomplished something that no other ship present at the exhibition could have managed. This was not a matter of opinion or subjective assessment. It was an objective fact supported by hard data and mathematical analysis. But here was the truly important part that made everyone reconsider their assumptions. The Perseverance had not succeeded because it possessed superior technology compared to other species. Its weapons were more primitive than what other civilizations used. Its sensors were less sophisticated. Its propulsion system was less efficient. By almost every measurable technical specification, the human ship was inferior to its alien counterparts. So how had it succeeded where more advanced ships would have failed? The answer lay in something much more fundamental than technology. It came down to completely different design philosophy and engineering priorities. The Perseverance had been built according to principles that prioritized survival and adaptability above optimization and efficiency. While other species designed their ships to perform specific tasks with maximum effectiveness under ideal conditions, humans had designed their ship to keep functioning even when conditions were far from ideal and multiple things went wrong simultaneously. This philosophical difference was embedded in every aspect of the ship's construction. The redundant systems that seemed wasteful by galactic standards were exactly what allowed the ship to continue operating after sustaining damage that would cripple more efficient designs. The primitive armor that seemed outdated compared to energy shields actually provided better protection in certain scenarios, particularly when dealing with sustained physical impacts from solid objects rather than energy weapons. Multiple civilizations began formally requesting technical consultations with human engineers. They wanted to understand the specific design choices that had made the Perseverance so resilient. How did human engineering teams decide what systems needed backup versions? What principles guided their decisions about structural reinforcement? How did they train crews to operate damaged equipment and improvise solutions when standard procedures failed? These were questions that many advanced civilizations had not seriously considered in thousands of years because their technology had become so reliable that catastrophic failures were extremely rare. They had optimized their designs to the point where they simply assumed things would work as intended, and they had lost institutional knowledge about how to function effectively when that assumption proved wrong. Ambassador Vexthar, the Tarn diplomat who had so publicly mocked and humiliated humanity just a few days earlier during the opening reception, requested a private meeting with Admiral Hayes. This was a significant diplomatic gesture because Vexthar was swallowing considerable pride by making this request. He had been very vocal and very public in his dismissal of human capabilities, and now he needed to acknowledge that his assessment had been completely wrong. During their private conversation, Vexthar asked a direct question that got to the heart of what was bothering him. He wanted to know why humanity had chosen to send such an old vessel to the exhibition when they must have known it would invite exactly the kind of mockery and dismissal that had occurred. Surely Earth had newer ships that would have made humanity look more advanced and more capable in the eyes of galactic observers. Admiral Hayes gave him an answer that was both simple and profound. She explained that humanity had sent the Perseverance specifically and deliberately because it was old, because it represented pure human engineering from before they had any contact with alien civilizations, before they had access to advanced alien technology or galactic scientific knowledge. The ship embodied how humans approached problems when they could not rely on having technological superiority or established solutions to fall back on. It reflected a particular mindset and philosophy that had been forged by humanity's evolutionary history on Earth, a planet that galactic xenobiologists classified as a death world due to its hostile environment and dangerous native life. Survival on Earth had required certain approaches that became deeply embedded in human thinking. Adaptability was essential because conditions changed constantly and unpredictably. Redundancy was necessary because single points of failure could mean death. The willingness to sustain damage while continuing to function was vital because avoiding all harm was simply not possible in such a dangerous environment. These survival strategies that humans had developed over millions of years of evolution influenced how they designed their technology, even when they were not consciously thinking about it. The Perseverance was a physical manifestation of Deathworld survival philosophy applied to spacecraft engineering. This philosophical difference between human and alien approaches had practical implications that were only now becoming clear to the established galactic powers. As these civilizations had grown more and more advanced over thousands of years of technological development, and as they had enjoyed increasingly long periods of peace and stability across most of the galaxy, they had gradually lost certain capabilities that came to seem unnecessary or wasteful in their comfortable, well-ordered society. They had forgotten how to design systems that could function effectively when absolutely everything went wrong at the same time. They had optimized away the redundancies and inefficiencies that made survival possible in truly desperate situations because those situations occurred so rarely in their experience that preparing for them seemed like wasting resources. The perseverance had reminded everyone of something important that comfortable civilizations tend to forget. Technological sophistication was not the same thing as actual capability in real-world crisis situations. Having the most advanced technology available did not automatically mean you could handle unexpected emergencies or adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Sometimes the most important capabilities were the ones that seemed primitive or outdated to sophisticated observers. Sometimes approaches that appeared inefficient or wasteful actually solved fundamental problems that elegant modern solutions had optimized away in pursuit of other goals like speed or power or efficiency under ideal conditions.